Albans. I'm the rector here at St. Albans, and it is a great joy, together with Father Josh Paget, our associate rector and chaplain at our campus chaplain, our parish staff, our vestry and wardens, and all of us here at the congregation of St. Albans welcome you warmly tonight. We're so glad to have you with us. It's a joy to see all of you friends and parishioners and students and neighbors and guests who share our love for thoughtful conversation at the intersection of faith, scholarship, and public life. At St. Albans, we often say that we are a community of belonging together, rooted in worship, in inquiry, and hospitality. The Howe lectures embody that calling. They were founded in honor of Daniel Walker Howe and Sandra Faye Shumway Howe, whose lives have long exemplified what it means to hold faith and reason in creative conversation. Dan and Sandra have given so much to the worlds of academia and the church alike. Dan's scholarship as a historian has illuminated the moral and religious imagination of early America, while Sandra's grace and intellect and warmth have strengthened every community that they've called home. Together, they have modeled a life of the mind enlivened by the life of the Spirit, a vision that we celebrate in this lecture series that bears their name. Here at St. Albans, we are profoundly grateful for their friendship, their generosity, and their faithfulness. Sandra and Dan, thank you for the witness of your lives, for your curiosity and your courage, and for helping us all remember that thoughtful faith matters. Tonight's lecture continues the legacy of Sandra and Dan Howe. It invites us to listen deeply to the wisdom of Scripture, to the groaning of creation, and to the Spirit's call to renewal. Please welcome me in joining, please join me in welcoming Sandra and Daniel Howe, whose example continues to inspire our life together and whose vision of a church engaged with the world continues to guide our work here at St. Albans. As we give thanks for the Howe's remarkable witness of faith, their scholarship and friendship, it is fitting that tonight's lecture turns our attention to one of the most urgent callings of our time, the care of God's creation. The Howe lectures were founded to foster conversations that unite theology and public life. And tonight's topic, Eco-theology and private property, a radical Episcopal critique, embodies that spirit perfectly. It invites us to reflect not only on what we believe, but on how we live together on this earth that we all share. Before we welcome our lecturer, I'm delighted to invite Deborah Ricketts to offer our second word of welcome. Deborah serves on the vestry here at St. Albans, and she leads our creation care ministry, which helps us to live more faithfully and sustainably as stewards of God's good earth. Please join me in making Deborah feel welcome.
Thank you, Father Adam. Good evening. I'm Deborah Ricketts, and I'm a member of the vestry here at St. Albans and one of the leaders of our creation care ministry. At St. Albans, we believe that caring for creation is part of our shared calling as people of faith. Stewardship starts not only with gratitude for the gifts we've received, but also with reverence for the earth itself, our first home, entrusted to us by God. In every generation, followers of Christ are called to ask how our lives can reflect that care, how we use what we've been given, how we live together, all of us, on this planet, and how our faith can help heal what is broken. Tonight's lecture feels particularly timely. we are honored to welcome a theologian whose work assists the Church in addressing these questions with clarity and courage. Dr. Andrew R. H. Thompson serves as Associate Professor of Theological Ethics and the Director of the Center for Religion and Environment at the School of Theology, this is long, at the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Saxophone Performance from Duquesne University, a Master of Arts in Religion from Yale Divinity School, and a PhD in Religion from Yale University. Before his current appointment, Dr. Thompson worked as an Episcopal missionary in El Salvador, where, with his wife, the Reverend Lee Preston, he helped establish a rural mission and school. This direct service in a land deeply impacted by environmental and social injustices continues to influence his ethical perspective today. Dr. Thompson's research centers on environmental ethics, post-colonial and anti-racist theologies, womanist and feminist ethics, social ethics, community organizing, and liberation theologies, each grounded in the belief that faith must respond to the cries of the earth and the poor. His 2015 book, All My Holy Mountain, A Christian Ethical Response to Mountaintop Removal Coal Mining, addresses the destruction of Appalachian landscapes. His latest book, Reconsider the Lilies, Challenging Christian Environmentalism's Colonial Legacy, encourages the Church to examine more closely how Christian environmentalism has been influenced by colonial and slave legacies, and urges imagining a more ecological future. We are so grateful to have him with us this evening as our lecturer for the Howe Lectures. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Andrew R. H. Thompson.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Deborah, for that lovely and comprehensive introduction. Can you all hear me all right? Okay. It's a privilege, it's an honor to be with you all here tonight. As I was flying here a couple of days ago, I can't, but yeah, thank you. I will speak up. Thank you. Flying here a couple days ago, I had a window seat, and it was a lovely, clear day, and I was continuously stunned by the grandeur of the landscape below us. Mountains and canyons highlighted by deep shadows, rivers brilliantly reflecting the fall sun. Occasionally, we flew over fields, dividing the landscape into geometric squares and circles. And I was struck by how insignificant and artificial these seemed compared to the rest of the landscape. Our feeble attempts to assert a human claim to dominance over this unconquerable landscape. How could we ever presume to believe anything this immense could belong to us? Something like that attitude is what is at the heart of tonight's lecture, though less poetic and in many, many more words. I will argue that the pressing environmental issues that we face, which are inextricably connected to issues of racism and colonialism, are predicated on an ideology of private property. If Christian environmentalism and environmental theology, or eco-theology, wish to address those issues adequately, they must reimagine the Church's theological relationship to private property. Incidentally, If by the end of this you are persuaded of the need to liberate yourself from some private property, I'm currently raising funds for the Center for Religion and Environment, which I direct. And I'll be happy to share that information with you. I forgot the donation cards they asked me to bring, but you can find us online, Center for Religion and Environment, Sewanee. We're happy to help relieve you of that burden. I'll first explain how current environmental injustices intersect with racism and colonialism, and how all three of these are related to private property. Then I will introduce a critical and distinctly Episcopal theology of private property, articulated by two lay, that is, not ordained clergy, Episcopal theologians, Vida, Dutton, Scudder, and William Stringfellow. I'll consider how their critiques apply to eco-theology and Christian environmentalism, and conclude by suggesting some practical implications of these ideas, and, if I'm being honest, some impractical ones as well. I want to begin by showing the theological connection between private property and environmental injustice, and particularly environmental racism and climate colonialism. By environmental racism, I mean the ways that communities of color are disproportionately affected by environmental harms. And by climate colonialism, I mean the ways environmental harms, especially but not only climate change, reproduce and reinforce the global historical injustices of colonialism. It is by now well known that environmental harms affect communities of color disproportionately. Even after adjusting for other variables like wealth or housing, race is the strongest indicator of whether a community is exposed to toxic pollution. The United Church of Christ documented environmental racism in its landmark 1987 report, Toxic Wastes and Race, and when it revisited the same questions in 2007, it found that environmental racism had actually worsened in those 20 years. The later report pointed specifically to several statistics, that at that time, Black children were 5 times more likely than white children to have lead poisoning, that 46% of affordable housing units sat within a mile of factories producing toxic emissions, that more than 600,000 students at nearly 120,000 schools in 5 states, largely students of color, attended school within a half mile of a known contaminated waste site. Hurricane Katrina, which struck New Orleans in 2005, received special attention in the 2007 report. The report notes that both protection during the storm and cleanup after it were unequally distributed according to race. Poor communities of color were less protected before the storm, and after it, much of the waste, including potentially toxic waste, was sent to predominantly African-American areas. This example of Hurricane Katrina illustrates that these inequalities apply not only to localized harms, like toxic waste, but to global problems like climate change, since hurricanes themselves are made more likely by changes to the global climate. This unequal distribution plays out in a variety of ways. Formerly colonized countries are more likely to experience the effects of climate change in the present and in the future than countries that have never been colonized. Within countries, too, effects of climate change like extreme heat affect communities of color disproportionately. The first official climate refugees of the United States were the Ile de Jean Charles Band of the Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw. They were awarded $48 million for relocation when sea level rise submerged their island, and with it, a crucial component of their culture. Even temperature is unevenly distributed. A study in New York City showed that heat wave deaths were higher in areas with large populations of color than in areas with largely white populations, which had more plants and air conditioners. The currents of colonialism and slavery currently being retraced by environmental racism and climate colonialism were established during the so-called Age of Discovery, and their theological foundations were laid by the complicity of the church in conquest. This complicity is most clearly exemplified in the doctrine of discovery, a legal and theological framework that has been used from the 15th century until the 21st century to justify the expropriation of land and the oppression, exploitation, and genocide of Black and brown bodies. The doctrine of discovery originates in a series of 3 papal bulls, documents from the Pope, written in the 15th century that granted the kings of Portugal and Spain papal permission to, quote, invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, that is, Muslims, and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ wheresoever placed, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery," end quote. Taken together, these documents establish an explicit theological justification for the legal right to the expropriation of land and the enslavement of non-Christian peoples all over the world. The doctrine of discovery affirmed colonizers and enslavers as agents of God's salvation and used that divine role explicitly to justify the right to claim and hold property. It also established legal precedent for centuries to follow. Beginning with an 1823 land dispute titled Johnson versus McIntosh, the Supreme Court of the United States has repeatedly cited the doctrine of discovery as legal justification to deny the rights of Native Americans to their land. The unanimous opinion in that case gave the right to dispose of the supposedly discovered lands exclusively to the government that had discovered them. The ruling encouraged states to enforce their claims to the land by removing Native Americans. And in the years following the ruling, Georgia sought to exercise its claim to Cherokee lands. In support of this claim, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, which laid the foundation for the forced removal of Cherokees and others that came to be known as the Trail of Tears. Johnson versus McIntosh and its appeal to the doctrine of discovery would be cited as legal precedent into the 21st century. In cases in 1954, 1985, and as recent as 2005, the court referred to the case and to the doctrine of discovery to deny Native American groups' attempts to reclaim lands lost by force or illegal purchase. The dominant category in the papal bulls implicated in the doctrine of discovery is not race, but rather religion. The worldview established there is one divided into faithful and infidel. Likewise, while they do refer to racial categories, the documents are not unique or novel in that regard. What is significant, though, is that by overlaying the religious categories onto racial categories, the popes take a significant step in the construction of whiteness by establishing black and white as markers of identity, salvation, and property. The doctrine of discovery reconfigures all three of these categories along racially constructed lines, with whiteness as the defining characteristic. The theologian Willie James Jennings describes this theological distortion as a theology of enclosure. That is, a theology that draws boundaries across and through places and people to create races, properties, and commodities, supposedly as a part of God's providence. The central agents in this process, according to Jennings, are the soldier, the merchant, and the missionary. That is, military might, corporations, and the church. As the first two used force to transform land and people into property, the third gave religious sanction to their efforts. Ultimately, says Jennings, this theology of enclosure, of places and people transformed into property, dominates and deforms our entire worldview, including our theology, in what he describes as, quote, a vision of owned existence and life lived through propertied relations. He concludes that this spirituality of ownership, built on the transformations brought about by racialized capitalism, is behind the current pathologies of violence, white supremacy, and environmental devastation. According to the legal scholar Cheryl Harris, the legal structures, both historical and current, that work to exclude non-white people from rights to property don't simply associate whiteness with property. They actually construct whiteness as property. I want to note here that when Harris and others talk about whiteness, they're speaking about whiteness as socially constructed, a legal and cultural concept created and perpetuated to justify privileging one racialized group at the expense of others. Harris states, regardless of which theory of property one adopts, the concept of whiteness, established by centuries of custom and codified by law, may be understood as a property interest. She says this is particularly true of a modern understanding of property, which views it in terms of function and social relations. If property is understood not as particular objects, but rather as a legal ordering of relationships to secure a right to control, then whiteness as property becomes clear. That is, rather than naming the things that one controls, property names a legal regime that entails the expectation of certain privileges with respect to those things. Central among these are use and exclusion. Property is a right to benefit from what I claim as mine and to exclude others from benefiting from it. On these functional criteria, whiteness, especially as enshrined in slavery and Jim Crow laws, clearly qualifies as a kind of property. More than anything else, whiteness is a cultural and sometimes legal construct meant to exclude others from its benefits. Among these privileges historically were the exclusive right to other kinds of property claims, such as those delineated by the doctrine of discovery over the land of Native Americans and over the bodies of enslaved persons. Harris even points to specific language from the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, the case that established the doctrine of separate but equal, indicating that in 1896, the courts held that denying a white person the right to that category of whiteness was literally to deny them valuable property. They said that. The Episcopal theologian Kelly Brown Douglas, building on Harris's work, and like Jennings, points to the theological underpinnings of this constructed property of whiteness. Because this property was seen as a tool of God's providence and as a vehicle of God's salvation, Douglas argues that whiteness is not only property, it is sacred property. It is, she says, quote, virtually the gateway, the key to salvation, end quote. And she contends that whiteness continues to exercise its property functions in contemporary society, as illustrated by the family of stand your ground laws that got attention following the killing of Trayvon Martin. With these laws, the right of a person to protect their home, a property right, is transferred to their body. Given the racially disparate protections of this group of laws, in effect, the property that is being protected is the person's whiteness. The legally constructed right to use violence to secure a property claim to land moves with white bodies, just as it did during the Age of Conquest. In these ways, from the doctrine of discovery to stand your ground laws, the ideology of property underwrites the transformation of people, land, and everything on the land into commodities, things to be bought and sold. This is Jennings's vision of, quote, owned existence and life lived through propertied relations. All this is not to suggest that private property is the sole or direct cause of environmental, racial, or colonial injustices. After all, notions of private property predate these pathologies. But the current world of environmental racism and climate colonialism is unthinkable without the particular Western understanding of property as absolute, individual, and inescapably connected to the historical construction of race. At the same time, this absolute notion of private property is so deeply embedded in our current worldview that challenging it seems equally unthinkable. As Jennings says, if our way of seeing and relating to the living world and each other has been formed inside the spirituality of ownership, then to think a different way of seeing and relating to the world and ourselves would mean thinking against what seems obvious, necessary, irreversible, and natural. It is to this task of thinking a different way that I now turn, with the help of two singularly Episcopal thinkers. First, Vida Dutton Scudder. The educator and activist Vida Dutton Scudder, born 1861, died in 1954, was a Christian socialist and the most prominent Episcopalian involved in the social gospel movement, the late 19th and early 20th century movement that sought to apply Christian principles to social and economic issues. Like other social gospel advocates, Scudder argues that the idea of the kingdom of God that's so central to Jesus' preaching expresses a social reality that can be brought about by policy reforms. Far from being inimical to Christianity, socialist policies make possible the moral world that's envisioned in the Beatitudes. Scudder's socialism is more often ideological and rhetorical than technical, but specifically she advocates for, quote, all means of production to be socialized and all private profit in industry to be done away. The world created by such policies, according to Scudder, would foster virtues like charity and compassion in forms more truly Christian than the degraded versions that pervade capitalist society. One of Scudder's clearest claims in this regard is her critique of private property. She points to the long Christian tradition skeptical of private ownership, from the common property of the early community in the book of Acts to early church thinkers like Augustine, who said, "Let us then, my brethren, abstain from private property, or at least from the love of it, if we cannot abstain from its possession," and John Chrysostom, who said, "To grow rich without injustice is impossible," both of them in the 4th century, to Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, who said, "Man should not consider his outward possessions as his own, but as common to all," to the Anglican bishop Charles Gore in the 19th century, who said, this is a long one, "It was largely because the church appeared as a society making the welfare of all its members its controlling principle in the acquisition and distribution of wealth, that it made the great progress which history records in the world of the Roman Empire." From her survey, Scudder concludes that the Holy Spirit is manifest not just in the fellowship of the Christian community, but in its material expression in the commonality of goods. Moreover, she insists that this socialist principle is one of the distinctive societal contributions, if not the defining contribution, of the movement that Jesus initiated. She says, "Jesus the door, Jesus the shepherd, shall open the way to a new social life of economic equality." In a concise pamphlet titled "The Christian Attitude Toward Private Property," Scudder dispenses with the argument that stewardship, that is, the idea that we hold possessions as stewards, accountable to God, that would be a more appropriate idea and a less radical attitude toward property. Stewardship, says Scudder, deals with property only superficially. First, by attending only to the use of wealth and not to its source, and second, by not dealing with property as an instrument of power. Quote, "The best Christian thinking," she argues, "has long seen in the power bestowed by wealth, rather than in any temptation to luxury involved, the most dangerous and literally satanic element inherent in possession." In other words, for her, the Christian critique of private property is less concerned with how unequal wealth is used, that's the problem that stewardship attempts to solve, than with how the unequal power imparted by wealth alienates those with it from those without it and dehumanizes both. That's her concern. William Stringfellow similarly saw the power of private property to dehumanize. Stringfellow was a lay lawyer who served indigent and marginalized populations in Harlem, was active in the civil rights and anti-war movements, and was a fierce critic of the church, especially as a supporter of women's ordination. That is, he was a supporter and criticized the church for that. At the core of Stringfellow's theology is the biblical image of the powers and principalities, or what he describes as demonic powers or powers of death. This image, prominent throughout the New Testament and central to the anti-imperial drama of the book of Revelation, is for Stringfellow the interpretive key for what he identifies as the biblical worldview, including its meaning for Christians in the contemporary world. Transposed into contemporary language, he says, the principalities become recognizable and all too familiar. They include all institutions, all ideologies, all images, all movements, all causes, all corporations, all bureaucracies, all traditions, all methods and routines, all conglomerations, all races, all nations, all idols. In short, the biblical language of powers and principalities is for Stringfellow a lens through which to understand all the ideological and institutional forces that subjugate and demand the loyalty of human beings. That is, as he says, they are idols. In a critique that is both scathing and shockingly prescient, Stringfellow identifies the state as the preeminent principality, the one most devoted to death. He describes the strategies of this demonic power in terms that could have come from any contemporary newspaper. To take just one example, quote, "The truth is usurped and displaced by a self-serving version of events or facts, with whatever selectivity, distortion, falsehood, manipulation, exaggeration necessary to maintain the image or enhance the survival or multiply the coercive capacities of the principality, that is, of the state." As relevant as Stringfellow's critique of the state is to our time, it is his argument about the church's response to the state that is most pertinent to this discussion. In an article for the magazine Christianity in Crisis in 1973, he considers the question of whether the church in America needs its own Barmen Declaration, the statement by the German confessing church against the abuses of Nazi Germany. He argues that no such statement is necessary because the church in the US is so captivated by the state that the state has no need for the kind of interference that had characterized the Nazi regime. The reason for this captivity, he says, is property. The church is so dependent upon its properties that threats to its tax-free status or promises of government support for church schools are enough to ensure its cooperation with the state. Stringfellow thus urges the church to divest itself of its property, as well as to renounce its tax-free status, not to pay taxes, but in order to be able to practice tax resistance. The other place where the church's witness, according to Stringfellow, is undermined by its financial holdings is around race. For all that churches may speak about racial equality, white people in the church were, and are, unwilling to relinquish meaningful control to people of color. Again, Stringfellow sees this as connected to the need of the church and of one particular group within the church to maintain the financial status quo, along with the class and status that entails. Additionally, he notes, again in a way that anticipates conversations today, that the church's financial investments may also make it complicit in some of the attitudes and practices it denounces by contributing to corporations that benefit from racial inequality. Again, he argues that giving up its various kinds of property would free the church to make the kind of radical witness that is called for. Scudder and Stringfellow are making different kinds of arguments here. Scudder, writing in a time of socialist optimism, wants the church to advocate for a society without private property, a socialist society. Absent a wholesale transformation, she, like her social gospel companions, wants the kind of piecemeal policies that meaningfully shift control of the means of production, that is, land, labor, and capital, more into the hands of the people, usually via the state. And indeed, in its time, the social gospel movement achieved many of its important policy goals, such as the creation of minimum wage and child labor laws. It's worth noting with respect to Scudder that, like many other socialists, she isn't arguing for the abolition of all property. Many socialists distinguish between personal property, the things individuals own and use as they go about their regular lives, and private property, the means of production owned by businesses and investors. Nor does Scudder believe that individuals, or I think churches, should give up their possessions unilaterally. She thinks that would be nice, following the example of ascetics like St. Francis of Assisi, who was a personal hero to Scudder. But she wants society to transform such that individuals and organizations no longer need private property. And then more fundamentally, I think she wants the church to realize what theologians have been saying for centuries, that private property is a construct, not an absolute right, and its legitimacy is conditional on its ability to serve the common good. For his part, Stringfellow has something different in mind. He has no illusions about a socialist transformation, and of course none of Scudder's faith in the state. He doesn't ask individuals to give up their property either. He's not much concerned with what individuals do at all. But he does think the church needs to do so in order to free itself from its dependence on principalities like money and the state. So as with Scudder, private property is an illusion, but here it's a more insidious one. And the church needs to disabuse itself of that illusion, not for the common good, but for the integrity of its resistance to the principalities. I'll return to the implications of these critiques of private property later. First, I want to consider what they have to say about eco-theology and creation care. Since the 1970s, Christians have worked to identify the ways our faith prompts us to respond to environmental devastation and climate crisis. Eco-justice, creation care, stewardship, and eco-theology are all different ways of talking about these responses within the broad category of Christian environmentalism. In my book, I parse some of these different terms and their histories. For our purposes, I'll focus on eco-theology, the theological claims and commitments that underwrite these different Christian approaches. By now, I expect many of the broad strokes of eco-theology and Christian environmentalism are well known. Notions of stewardship that view care for creation as human special charge given by God, a sense of justice that extends beyond human communities to include the whole creation, a spirituality of creation that connects us deeply with ecological communities. We typically no longer have to begin by explaining why the environment matters to Christians, at least in more progressive denominations. The breadth and saturation of this eco-theology is an important accomplishment, owing to the hard work and advocacy of a generation of conscientious Christians. At the same time, eco-theology has often failed to take seriously the racialized and colonialist legacies with which I began. More than 20 years ago, the Black liberation theologian James Cone argued that in environmental ethics and eco-theology, quote, "There is hardly a hint that perhaps whites could learn something of how we got into this ecological mess from those who have been the victims of white world supremacy," end quote. And in many ways, his critique remains relevant today. For the most part, mainstream Christian environmentalism has yet to engage in the kind of radical self-critique of its own whiteness that Cone called for over 2 decades ago. Such a critique requires white environmental activists and thinkers to go beyond simple inclusion to consider the whiteness that is at the very heart of much of our environmental theology. More importantly, it requires the willingness to relinquish, in truly meaningful ways, the power and privilege that whites have maintained in Christian environmentalism. In my book, I indicate 4 characteristics of eco-theology's failure to reckon adequately with racism and colonialism: its account of justice, its view of science, its understanding of the natural world, and its focus on a narrow theology of creation. To summarize these just briefly, first, eco-theology and Christian environmentalism have tended to incorporate an account of justice that is general and inclusive, but that doesn't focus directly on the politics of racial inequality. Until recently, for example, accounts of humanity's alienated relationship with the natural world have rarely included, in the words of ethicist Larry Rasmussen, the history of coercion, brutality, cultural genocide, and worse that are a major part of that story of alienation. Second, eco-theologies have typically viewed science as an unproblematic ally, a seemingly obvious attitude for theologians and Christians concerned with environmental issues. Yet this approach has failed to see what activists from communities of color have long argued, that environmental science can be and has been controlled and manipulated by those in power to perpetuate injustice. Third, Christian environmentalism, like mainstream environmentalism in general, has often been shaped by a commitment to the ideal of pristine wilderness. Yet this image itself is a product of the theologies of enclosure described by Jennings earlier. Wilderness is a construct, and one that was specifically designed to erase the history of non-white peoples on the land and literally to remove those people from the chosen spaces. Whiteness and wilderness have always reinforced one another. Fourth, Christian eco-theology has almost exclusively drawn on the creation accounts in the book of Genesis for its theology of creation. This seems obvious. Where else would one look? Yet the Genesis accounts, which, it always bears repeating, are not one story, but at least 2 distinct stories, are not the only creation stories in the Bible, or even the oldest ones. They're simply the first in the canonical order. Integrating the accounts from books like Proverbs, the Psalms, Job, or even the final book of Revelation would lead to eco-theologies that are not only more complicated, but more social and more political. This is just a brief summary of the larger critiques that I make in my book. In short, Christian eco-theology has mostly been unwilling to address environmental racism and climate colonialism directly. But here I want to consider how Scudder's and Stringfellow's arguments deepen this challenge. Interestingly, both Stringfellow and Scudder do address environmental issues in various places in their writing, and that's particularly striking in the case of Scudder, who was writing at the turn of the 20th century. It is, however, their arguments about private property that are most relevant to the interconnected issues of racism, colonialism, and environmental degradation. These arguments suggest that the limitations of eco-theology that I just mentioned reflect the deeper failure of the church to question its relation to private property. Recall that Scudder's critique of property directly addresses the idea of stewardship, an idea that has always been central to eco-theology. If stewardship says that we care for the wealth we have as entrusted to us by God, Scudder argues that such a view fails to consider the ways these resources mediate power relationships, and so leaves those unequal power dynamics in place. This applies equally to the gifts of creation as to financial resources. An environmental stewardship approach to creation may seek to care for the lands and ecosystems under our control, that is, under the direct control of the church or of its members or of the communities in which the church participates. But it doesn't question the legitimacy of those claims of control or the power relationships that make that control possible. Or consider Stringfellow's call to the church to deepen its social and anti-racism witness by divesting itself of its various forms of property. The situation he described in 1964, where the church's protest against racism was undermined by its unwillingness to meaningfully relinquish power, privilege, or property, remains the case today, both generally and in the church's environmental work. The church speaks against inequality and in favor of inclusion, but only to the extent that its financial stability and status remain unchanged. Divestment, which Stringfellow addressed directly, is a clear example. The Episcopal Church has agreed to divest its endowments of fossil fuel investments in fossil fuel companies, but not the church's pension fund, which holds vastly more resources than the church itself. So through its commitment to its financial stability, the church continues to be implicated in the global injustices of environmental racism and climate colonialism. Taken together, these two Episcopal thinkers support Willie James Jennings' argument that if eco-theology wants truly to confront the interconnected pathologies of environmental racism and climate colonialism, it must attempt to think against what seems obvious, necessary, and natural, the absolute right to private property. The historical injustices that give rise to these issues are in turn predicated on what Jennings calls a theology of enclosure and a spirituality of ownership, and these are what must be challenged in the church's attitudes and practices. This begins with the kind of attitudinal shift I described earlier with respect to Scudder. From the earliest days of Christianity, theologians have argued that the wealth of creation is not subject to private ownership, but belongs to all. Seen that way, whatever wealth or property the church controls does not belong properly to the church, but is meant for the good of the whole community. And I would add, of the non-human community as well. How would the church's social and environmental ministries change if they began with the assumption that our property, be it financial resources or our land, already belongs to others, and we are simply finding ways to be accountable to that common ownership? Stringfellow and Scudder name a few particular implications. I've already mentioned divestment. Both argue that at a minimum, the church needs to divest itself from any financial interest in industries that benefit from harm to the broader community. This makes sense from a stewardship perspective as a responsible use of our resources, but it becomes nothing less than a requirement if we recognize that these resources are not ours in the first place, not intended for our private benefit, but only for the good of all. Today, in the context of the church's environmental witness, this would mean, above all, divesting from fossil fuel companies. But as Scudder says, it may not stop there. Quote, "If Christian people in general," she says, "should discover by any chance that the sources of income under the present system can rarely bear scrutiny when exposed to the flashlight of conscience, then they may decide that the present system has got to go. In other words, the church may ultimately find itself called to more comprehensive forms of divestment from the market." Related to divestment, Stringfellow also specifically advocates reparations for slavery, not only as a form of racial justice, but as a way of freeing the church's witness from captivity to the principalities. He says, "Theologically, reparations is a means of validating repentance. Reparations also offer an extraordinary opportunity to the white ecclesiastical establishment to be saved from the importunities of other institutions, especially the state. Real material steps toward reparations on the part of the church, in the form of financial payments and investment in communities of color, are part of the church's resistance to the racialized ideology of private property. A related action that Stringfellow and Scudder don't name is land restitution. That is, returning meaningful control of the land to its original indigenous inhabitants. The Episcopal Church was the first denomination to officially renounce the doctrine of discovery at its 2009 General Convention in Anaheim. But as Mark Charles and Seung-Chan Rah argue in their book, Unsettling Truths, as long as churches implicitly rely on the legal claims to land that are based on the doctrine of discovery, those protests ring hollow. I would add that our environmental and creation care efforts simply perpetuate the violence of colonialism unless we seriously address the question of returning the stolen land on which we sit. If such a thing seems impossible, that is simply a testimony to how deeply entrenched the ideology of property is. But when churches have approached this issue not from the question of whether it's possible, but from the belief that it is required, they have not only found creative ways of returning control of the land, such as through cooperative agreements, but have also found meaningful, constructive relationships with local indigenous communities. I noted that for Scudder in particular, the goal remains the transformation of society through policy changes. At present, her optimism seems wildly out of reach. Nonetheless, the idea of a Green New Deal, an environmentally conscious version of the kinds of redistributive and labor policies that Scudder advocated, remains a live conversation in American politics. Many of the relevant policies were in fact part of the Inflation Reduction Act, though the fact that they were only politically viable under that label, inflation reduction, again shows that the interests of private property remain our most powerful political motivations. Other policy shifts would include just climate finance policies toward formerly colonized countries, not as an act of charity, but as basic justice. At the other end of the spectrum are more radical, we might say Stringfellonian interventions. The activist and writer Vicky Osterweel has argued that looting is best understood as an act of resistance against the racist ideology of private property. Looting, she says, quote, reveals that the idea of private property is just that, an idea, a tenuous and contingent structure of consent backed up by the lethal force of the state. Similarly, Swedish environmental activist Andreas Malm argues that acts of sabotage, which are violence against property but never against humans, are a justified response to acts of environmental violence like pollution and climate change. Radical though these claims are, they would likely be endorsed by Stringfellow, who saw anti-war protesters' burning of draft cards as a sacramental act. Perhaps a more moderate version of these kinds of acts of resistance can be seen in the idea of commoning. Commons are spaces or resources of shared use, to which all members of a community have certain rights. In the context of a capitalist system that privatizes control of such spaces and resources, the commons has become a symbol of resistance, and ultimately a verb. Commoning represents an ethic of relationships that is antithetical to the absolute individualism of the private property regime. It is a commitment to mutualism and equitable relationships among humans and between humans and nature. But commoning is also concrete communities and practices that enact such cooperative commitments. For example, the theologian George Zachariah identifies the resistance of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe against the Dakota Access Pipeline in 2016, resistance in which the Episcopal Church was a prominent participant, as a practice of commoning. Such practices also recall the common ownership that characterized the early church in the book of Acts. As Willie James Jennings recognizes, reimagining our relationship to the deeply entrenched ideology of ownership means rethinking what seems imminently natural and obvious. Nonetheless, this rethinking has centuries of Christian tradition behind it, as well as the distinctive voices of two lay Episcopal theologians. And if the church is to reclaim the integrity of its environmental witness, especially with respect to environmental racism and climate colonialism, this reimagining is as necessary as it is deeply challenging. Thank you. Thank you. And I'm happy to take some questions.
if you'd like to ask a question, I've been given a microphone to bring to you so that everybody can hear your question. Raise your hand, and I will be your filled on you. That's a joke for the older crowd. College students ask a person, they'll explain it.
I guess, other than the very nice alliteration involved in climate colonialism, it's easier for me to hear the first pairing of words than the second, because how does
If you don't mind, I can try to anticipate the rest of your question. Sure. Yeah. Sure, yes. Great question. The question was, what is climate colonialism, given that colonialism seems to be an act that mostly affected human communities, and how does that bear on something like climate change? To which I would also add, I think another part of that question is climate affects everyone equally, seemingly, right? Climate is global, climate change is global. How can that be something that follows the tracks of colonialism? I think the most straightforward answer, colonialism does name, historically, the political and economic arrangements that mostly ended during the 20th century. There actually still are formal colonies today. There are countries that live under colonial regimes still, some of them under American colonialism. But most of that formally ended through the 20th century. But the economic and political inequalities created by those persist in what's called neocolonialism. And in addition to the ways that, just given the vagaries of climate, certain places are more affected, right? Things like drought, flood, are more likely to affect certain climates, certain places, certain regions, and many of those are formerly colonized. But also, the ability of communities to adapt to the effects of climate change, to adapt and respond to those kinds of effects, that's called climate resilience. And that has a lot to do with economic stability, political stability, and those are exactly the things that were undermined by colonialism and continue to be undermined by neocolonialism. So in addition to experiencing directly the physical effects, often more strongly than places that were not colonized, the formerly colonized countries often lack the economic, political, and social resources necessary to adapt and to build that climate resilience that would help them respond and come back from those effects. Does that clarify that? Okay, thank you.
Anybody? We're one for one. Question asked, question answered. Back here. Great, thank you.
I have a question about reparations.
Yeah.
I have kind of two questions. Can you expand on how that might look and or differ between the different geographic areas in our country? African Americans in the South and the East Coast, Indigenous Americans on the West Coast that predated it being the United States.
Yeah.
And I think related, do you think the United States will ever make slavery illegal? Most people don't realize that slavery is legal for the punishment of a crime to this day.
Yeah. I'm going to decline to address the second question. I think it's an absolutely important one, and it's just not something that I have the expertise to speak to. I'll say I hope someday, but with respect to the first question, mostly the conversation about reparations has to do with reparations for slavery, and so mainly towards African American descendants of enslaved persons. Although Ta-Nehisi Coates, a long time ago, or several years ago, made an argument that actually Jim Crow laws and even redlining policies were a more relevant target for reparations, because many of the people who directly suffered under those legal regimes are still alive and still experiencing the impacts of those. Nonetheless, the focus there is on African American communities. And again, I think similar to what I said about land restitution, if we begin the conversation from a place, rather than from a question of, is this possible, begin it from a position of, it is required by justice, so what does it look like? There are actually a lot of interesting creative solutions that people have developed. And most importantly, develop in conversation with the communities affected, right? So I'll give one example, because it's one that I'm involved with. The University of the South, Sewanee, where I live, as you might guess from the name, has a troubled racial history. It was founded in the 1860s, right before the Civil War. It didn't actually start until immediately after the Civil War. And in its founding documents explicitly said that it was for the education and cultivation of the distinctive culture of the South, including the culture of slavery. Like, that's there in our founding documents, right? And most of the funders who founded the university were not only slaveholders, but many of them slave traders, and many of them enslaved hundreds of people on massive plantations. So our university is very historically complicit in this injustice. And so this question of reparations is absolutely incumbent on us. And so one of the things that we've done is a historian at our university they've created a center called the Roberson Center for Reconciliation. I forget what the whole title is, but looking into this history and investigating exactly who were the founders, how many people did they enslave, where were they, right, and mapping all that information. And the Center for Religion and Environment, together with this Roberson project, we've reached out to some of these communities where our founders had historically owned plantations and enslaved hundreds of people, to begin conversations with them about what sort of collaborative community development projects might look like, right? So it's not just about funding, although that has to be part of it, but it's about developing a relationship and having conversations to find out how we can sort of work to overcome these persisting injustices in relationship. So that's just one example. Another Episcopal seminary, Virginia, has done some major financial reparations, including, I think, giving scholarships or some kind of financial support to any students from, who are descended from folks connected to that university's slaveholding past as well. Things like that. So I think that my answer is there are a lot of ways that it can be done. I think it absolutely has to be material. It has to be concrete, not just sort of good vibes. And it has to mean something. It has to be a significant, I think, a significant step, not just sort of something on the margins or nominal. Yes.
Hello. So on the eve of Veterans Day, my question has to do with the church's stance on militarism, considering the U.S. military is the #1 polluter in the world with 800 plus bases in 80-some countries. And not only that, but just the fact that their military emissions are not even included in a country's emission totals.
Yeah.
I mean, not just the U.S., but worldwide. And
Yeah.
people don't really realize that. And I feel like the church is not, I don't know. I don't know what the church is saying about that, especially not to mention our direct wars, but our indirect funding of our allies and their bombing campaigns,
Right.
and the colonialism of just extraction, resource extraction. So
Yeah.
I guess I have a lot of things on my mind. I'm not
Yeah.
sure what my question is. My question is, what is the church doing about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. The military, popped up a few places in the lecture because that was part of this process of ideological transformation was also absolutely the military force that seized the control, right? It's your claim of property is only as good as your ability to enforce it, and that was how it happened. So it's absolutely tied up in all of this. And you're right, the question of emissions, the emissions created by the military. The interesting thing on the other side of that is that the US military has actually been far more progressive in its attempts to adapt and build climate resilience because they realize what a threat climate change is potentially going to be to their mission of defending the United States. So at the same time that many in the government will not use those words, climate change, the military is all over it. They know that it's happening and they're doing everything they can to prepare for it. In terms of the church's witness against militarism, so officially, the Episcopal Church doesn't have, as far as I'm aware, any official stance on war. Generally, the Episcopal Church's sort of de facto stance has been what's called just war, which is a set of criteria to say war is only legitimate under these conditions. And that's good as far as it goes. And I think in the context of modern war, generally even just war would say you can't do it. Like the nature of modern conflict is such that those criteria don't apply, and so under that theory of just war, you would have to rule out most modern conflicts. But returning to Stringfellow, my current favorite theologian, his argument against the state, against the powers and principalities, he was a fierce anti-war protester and actually was arrested for harboring Daniel Berrigan, the Roman Catholic anti-war protester, because they were close friends. And as I said, Stringfellow saw anti-war protests like burning draft cards as sacramental. So he was an absolute pacifist in his theology and thought that the church needed to be pacifist. And with respect to some of what I was saying about property, and particularly about his call to the church to renounce its tax-free status, right? A big part of that has to do with, by paying taxes, you become complicit in the wars that are fought in your name and using your money. And so the church doesn't pay taxes, but that's because it gets this special dispensation from the government. He thinks the church should be required to pay taxes, should voluntarily subject itself to that requirement for the purpose of breaking it, for the purpose of not paying taxes and potentially being punished for it. He thinks that would, be a legitimate witness, among other things, against the military and against war. And I think that's a compelling argument. There's a question over here.
So I'm trying to ask a question about property. And let me give one example. I grew up in Wyoming. Wyoming is a state where huge swaths of territory are federal government. Mm-hmm. They're not owned by any private individual. But if you talk to someone in Wyoming about property, it is sacrosanct.
Yeah.
And the notion that this land is mine is very, very deeply embedded. And we have huge swaths of land there that have been entrusted to the federal government. And I think this is at least potentially an example of what you're calling commoning. And now we see a government in place that is trying to privatize much of that land. And so that's one example. The other example I'm thinking of is these private prisons that have arisen, where we used to have governments were responsible for prisons. Now we give them over to companies and shield our governments from responsibility for them. So given how deeply embedded some of these kind of concepts are, what do you see as useful ways to try to break down that concept of property, and to show examples of commoning that can reach some of these really hard to reach places?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a challenging question because it's sort of the question of effectiveness, right? And I think what we understand as realistic or what we understand as effective is already so deeply shaped by our kind of cultural parameters, right? This is what Jennings is talking about when he says how hard it is to think against what seems so natural. And, you know, it also points, like your point about public lands in a place like Wyoming, and then how vulnerable they become, right? And the reason, of course, that they're vulnerable is because they could be profitable, right? And so it does, it in a way, kind of supports something like Scudder's wholesale socialism, right? Because it shows how vulnerable kind of common ownership or public ownership is when it's in the middle of a dominant kind of private property or capitalist ethos. And so, you know, how you would build the kind of momentum, the kind of critical mass that would take to actually change that, I don't know. I think particularly, you know, I sort of noted Scudder is writing in a different time. Stringfellow seems more realistic for our time, and his point, you know, is not necessarily that we can be effective in this way, but that this is the only way for us to have integrity, the only way for us to be truthful, with the hope that perhaps someday it ends up being effective. But in the meantime, we preserve this witness of a kind of resistance, right, in awaiting that possibility.
So I appreciate that. I'm reminded of the early work of abolitionists.
Yeah.
Who simply said this can't stand. We have to get rid of it. And of course, there were all the practical arguments as to why not. I guess that's why I think it's so important to identify those examples where where it can be done, and to communicate those.
Yeah, and that's a great example, because it is an example of something that seemed unthinkable until it was inevitable. Yeah. If I can take my prerogative to ask myself a question that I was sort of concerned about being asked, which is towards the end here: am I advocating looting or sabotage? I don't think that I am. I think, like I said, I think Stringfellow would, but I think I'm suggesting that we can at least reevaluate how we view things like that, right? That they aren't kind of mindless or chaotic or violent, at least not in the way they're typically described. They are actually acts of resistance against precisely the kinds of violence that are inscribed into the system already.
Do we have other questions?
Okay. Well, thank you all very much for the conversation.
Thank you again so much for being here this evening. There is a reception following this presentation out on St. Alban's patio, to which you were all invited, very cordially invited. There's plenty of food, there's drink, and there's time for fellowship and further conversation with Dr. Thompson, and an opportunity to get to know each other better. So again, thank you so very much for your participation this evening, for being here tonight, and for your support of the Howe Lectures. God bless you. Good night.